Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, mail.wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening. COVID-19 vaccines were given to tens of thousands of people in early clinical trials and to hundreds of millions of Americans since. Top health experts agree that COVID-19 vaccines are safe, effective. Vaccinate.wv.gov or contact your local health department. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. This show was originally recorded in 2018 when Hurricane Florence was threatening the area. This year, we have drought alongside of flash flooding, so I thought the information shared might be applicable. So even if you weren't in one of the areas affected by flash floods, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So tune in and be prepared should a flood event come to you. There are some things that you can do to help protect your farm for rising floodwaters that may be associated with the storms that are still coming our way. I know there are several places that got flooded in this last round, but all of us have been inundated with water. All of our soils are super saturated. We're going to start seeing slips if we're not already seeing them. And with more rain potentially coming, we really need to plan ahead, because when it starts raining, the soil is already full, so it's not going to absorb a whole lot for us. So we're going to see faster flooding and more severe. So do make sure if Florence tends to come this way that you are going to be prepared for it. So, you have your standard preparation things. We're making sure you have 3 days worth of food and water for every person in your family, and a day's worth of water for a person is 3 gallons. So, multiply 3 by the number of people in your family, and then multiply that again by 3. That's how many gallons of water you need. And that is for cooking and drinking. It is not water for bathing, so keep that in mind as well. If you lose water during a storm, that is your number one concern. You need to be able to have something to drink. Maybe having some spare water for flushing toilets that you can just dump down the drain should the water be shut off for an extended period. Some places, sometimes you can fill your bathtub with water. A hot water tank that has not been flooded still has clean, usable water in it. You can do that as long as you make sure that you turn off the incoming tap before you start draining it to get the water out to drink. Now, if you haven't drained your hot water tank in a long time, which probably most of us have not, you are going to get quite a large amount of sediment out the first time you drain it. So that's something you should consider in your home maintenance, is draining that hot water tank so that you can have a nice reserve of clean water should your water be shut off for an extended period of time. Now, for those of you who are using well water, it is essential that you take precautions now to make sure if your wellhead is in a low-lying area and could potentially be flooded, whether by a creek overflowing, a flash flood coming down from the top of the hill, or if you're in a river rising area. These are all things you need to take into consideration. You know who you are, and even if you don't think it could happen to you, but you're near a creek or stream, it's still something to consider taking precautions against. You do not want your water supply to be infiltrated with floodwater that, say, maybe ran across a livestock field. It's full of bacterial contaminants, or raising river water that may be full of even worse things like heavy metal contaminants. So we definitely want to make sure that you are protecting your wellhead and storing up a lot of drinking water before the flood, should a flood come our way. It's always a good idea to inspect your wellhead regularly, make sure that it doesn't have any cracks, that your seals are still good, that there aren't any problems, there's not a lot of debris piled up around it. Of course, you want to make sure you're not storing any pesticides near your wellhead or anything that could contaminate it from that perspective. If it's possible to turn off your pump and remove that pump and store it in a dry place, if you know you're going to get flooded, it might be something you want to do. Of course, you want to make sure that this isn't going to damage your wellhead in any way. So if it's a sealed pump and it's not something you just take off and remove, then that's definitely not going to work for you. But you do want to cover your wellhead with multiple layers of plastic. So just a thick plastic bag, garbage bag would work, but you want to seal that on there with electrical tape and then seal it again with duct tape and then put another bag on and repeat the process. You want to make sure you're covering any opening from the cap to the vent to any electrical conduits that are running into it. You want to make sure all of the openings for your well are well secured to protect it from rising floodwaters. And, this is something that you need to have written down or just discuss it with your family of, hey, do we have a farm or home emergency plan? What are we going to do if this happens? Who do we go to? Where are we going? What's our meeting place? Having an emergency plan is essential in keeping yourself, your family, and your home safe should a severe weather event occur. Now, hopefully, we won't get any rain from these hurricanes, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. So again, make sure that you have a weather radio. If you do not have one of those, NOAA weather radios, I highly recommend getting one. You may say, well, I use my phone app for checking weather, but if the cell phone towers are down, your phone isn't going to do you any good. It's great to have your phone charged up and have a backup battery because a lot of times those cell towers are on high ground, but if you do not have cell phone towers up, or if there's no power to the cell phone tower, then you're going to be looking for a battery-powered or wind-up NOAA weather radio to get you information on current weather events and what you need to do if there is a declared weather emergency. Now, one thing that farms need to think about that homeowners don't is livestock. While a homeowner can make plans for their pets during an emergency, maybe researching which shelters take pets and making plans for their transport and keeping them. Make sure you have a dog crate. A lot of times if you're in a mass shelter, they will require your dog to be in a crate. So make sure you have one of those that will fit your animal. And sometimes during severe fear events, dogs can get pretty nervous. Any animal's going to get scared in a storm, including humans. So make sure that you're prepared for your dog or cat and make sure that they have what they need to feel comfortable and safe. Whether your dogs are really close and they need to be connected in the same container, or if they need to be separated because one of them's really super anxious and might get bitey during a storm. You know your animals and you know what to do. But for livestock, you really can't take livestock to a shelter. You can't do that. So you need to have an evacuation plan for your livestock if your livestock are in an area that could be damaged by a severe weather event. So think about, is there a hilltop you can use? If all of your grazing land and hayland is in a low-lying area, talk to your neighbors and see if there should be rising floodwaters. Can you bring your animals onto their land? And, farmers, I know, have a history of working together and supporting each other, so I don't think this will be an issue, especially if it is talked about up front. Where can you share resources? How can you coordinate together to make sure all the feed is up out of the floodwaters? You don't want to have to deal with mycotoxins once the floodwaters receive and your feed got wet and, okay, is this going to kill my cattle now? Is there botulism growing? Did this mess up my pH level? There's a lot of things to consider. So it's best if you can just keep your feed out of the waters, especially, floodwaters touching, it's basically same as human food. If floodwater touches your animal feed, you have to get rid of it. It's no longer safe to eat because of things like mycotoxins, heavy metals, botulism, all of these potential problems that can come along with it. So make sure you're storing your feed at higher ground. If you think you may have to evacuate, make sure that you contact your veterinarian. You have all your needed health papers for crossing state lines. I know, especially here in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, crossing state lines happens when you sneeze too hard. So having your papers is pretty standard, but if you're more in a centralized area away from state lines, you may not have all that on hand. But that's something you really need to consider, especially if there is a large storm coming your way, to have any papers that you need to make sure you can safely evacuate your animals across state lines. If it's not feasible to move your livestock across or out of an area of danger, make sure they're at higher ground, make sure they have adequate food, and make sure they have adequate clean water that will last them until your return. So if you're being evacuated, you're going to be gone for multiple days. So make sure that you're not going to come back to dead livestock that were safely tucked away on top of a hill, but they just ran out of food or they didn't have any clean water. So make sure that you're allowing them extra food that can last them until you're able to get back. Also, marking your animals with an identifier will help ease the return. Say if they get scared, they run off, someone finds it, you have this poor calf that's wandering around in nowhere, someone finds it. How do they know it's yours? How do they get it back to you? So having ear tags that have farm name and phone number, having specific branding that identifies it as yours, or even if you have none of those materials handy, just getting some clippers and, clip identifier into the sides of all of your cattle or goats or whatever you have, or paint a marking on them so that if they do get scared and bolt, that you can get them back when they are found again. Also, if you have animals that rely on ventilation, say if you have a poultry house or a hog house and you rely on ventilation to keep those animals alive, to keep those fumes out, you need to make sure you have a backup plan for your electricity. You need to check your generators regularly, fill all your gas tanks, make sure that you are not killing your own animals simply by losing electricity. Also, make sure if you have feeding systems that run on electricity, you need to make sure that you have that backup generator ready to go and functional. Also, if you are in an area that may have flooding, you want to make sure that you secure any items that could float away, store them, pick them up, put them away, clean up the yard, and if you have propane tanks, make sure you secure them down so that they're not going to be floating away. Always make sure you turn off the propane supply at the tank so if it does get hit by a hard rush of water, it doesn't cause an explosion, which is definitely going to cause more harm than your tank simply floating away. So do make sure you turn off a propane supply if high waters are expected. Also, your equipment is extremely expensive and valuable, and while you should have it insured, it still sucks to be out of a tractor for a couple weeks until you get that insurance payment back. So make sure you're moving your equipment to the highest ground possible, away from any trees that could fall and cause damage on it. So you definitely do not want floodwater. Floodwater contains a whole lot of silt and debris, and it can get into the nitty-grittiest, teeny tiniest crevices in your motors, and it can be next to impossible to repair. So you definitely want to make sure all of your equipment is at the highest ground possible. Also, pesticide storage. Pesticide storage areas need to be protected from flooding. Not only are pesticides extremely expensive to use and lose, they are extremely dangerous once they get set loose in our water systems, potentially causing harm as they float downstream to other farmers' crops. I said earlier that you always already want to move your feed to higher ground, but also consider making sure your feed is in an accessible place. If there's a particular road that you travel down to get to this particular field where you store your hay, and the the hay is in a good place, but that road floods continually and takes days to go down. If you can't get to your hay, it doesn't matter that it's in a nice, safe place. You still need to make sure that you have enough feed on hand for your animals, and then consider, okay, am I going to have trouble getting to my feed if it's stored in this particular location? And again, I can't stress enough, work with your neighbors, have checklists with your neighbors, check in on them, especially if there's elderly neighbors around that may be having some problems. Make sure you have extra supplies of all of your medications. You should have at least 3 weeks supply of all medications that are sustenance medications, your heart medication, your diabetes medication, if you have a hormonal replacement, anything like that that you have to take every day or there will be detriment to your health. Make sure you have that on hand. Also, a good first aid kit can never be underestimated in its importance. Always wear good shoes when working around floodwater. Infected cuts are one of the number one problems that are associated after floods. So make sure you have good solid boots when you're working around floodwaters, and that you have your tetanus shots updated. All right, so other things that you might want to think about if you are in a flood-prone area and you are growing crops. Let's say you're growing potatoes and they're almost ready to harvest. You just want to give them a little bit more time so you can try to make sure they're really good size. And there's a flood predicted to come across your field in the next week. You may want to consider taking a hit on that harvest and get it out of the ground a little early. Because if floodwaters come up, say the Ohio River jumps over its banks and comes over your field, that field is going to be inundated with heavy metals and bacterial contamination, and you can no longer harvest those potatoes. Those potatoes are considered adulterated, even though they weren't actually in the water. The water goes down into the soil, and so the federal government considers that to be adulterated food, and so any root crops that are exposed to floodwaters are considered adulterated and must be disposed of. Now, if you have a crop that you have to dispose of, please make sure you are keeping records of what is lost. Not only for your own tax purposes, but for insurance purposes. And also, let us know at the Extension Office or the FSA office so we know what damage has come. And that gets built into damage declarations too for reimbursements and things. So it's really important that you let us know if you do have a crop loss, just so that we can report it to the proper people that need to know. So let us know and keep track of things. Now, say you're growing tomatoes and the floodwaters come up, but you've already harvested all of the low tomatoes, and so the floodwater never actually touches the tomatoes. In fact, the floodwater couldn't even splash up because your tomatoes are so high up on their vines now because it's later in the season. So those tomatoes could be considered fine as long as you're going to have to make that judgment. You go out, you see how high the water was, you see where the debris and silt line were left on the leaves, you can tell how long it was out there. So you're going to know about your field, and as long as you are sure that those particular tomatoes were never in contact with the floodwater, you may still sell them. Now, for extra precaution, you may want to run them through some Sanidate or some chlorine to make sure, but you have to make that judgment call as to whether or not you think they're safe to sell into the food system at that point. Obviously, if the tomatoes were touching the floodwater or floodwater could have splashed up on them, you want to get rid of those and count them as a loss for that particular harvest. Because you definitely don't want to introduce a adulterated food product into the food chain. Not only is that bad for people's health, it's bad for business, and it's bad for agriculture as a whole. So let's make sure that we are making sure we do everything we can. So you have a flooded field, floodwaters are receding, and you've got piles of debris. Typically, if you only have like an inch, 1 to 4 inches of grasses and leaves and things that have built up, you can pretty much till those in without having a big deal about it. If once you get above 4 inches, you probably are going to want to pile and burn that once it's dry, just to get rid of it. You don't want that much to be stored in your soil. The one thing I want everyone to know is if you are in a flooded area, keep in mind that the soil shifts. As the water moves on top, it causes the soil to shift. It causes things underneath the soil to shift. So it is essential before you start digging and plowing and burying debris and such, you want to make sure that you call 811 to be confident that those gas pipelines haven't shifted underneath that field and cause a potential explosion. You definitely don't want to be involved in that. So always call 811 after a flood before you go out into a field and start digging things up or resetting fence posts. You just really want to know where those lines have gotten shifted to. All right, so things to consider when you are looking at your plants as to whether or not you can save that crop is where did the water come from? You know, if you're at the top of the hill and you just get a whole lot of water and it comes down across your cornfield into your produce field, that's not really much to worry about. Now, if you're further down on the hill and it comes across a pasture field into your produce field, then that's definitely a concern. So you do want to make sure that if you are downhill from pasture fields, that you have around the edges of your produce area a way to divert the water away so that it's not running straight across some cow poop into your tomatoes. All right, it might be great fertilizer, but it's not great to eat. So you do want to make sure that you know where the water is coming from when you're making that decision as to whether or not those vegetables are still safe to eat. Again, any root crops that are exposed to floodwaters are considered contaminated. There's really nothing you can do about that because the water is sitting on top of them and goes down into the soil. And then when you pull it back out of the soil, then it touches the soil as it comes out. So there's really, unfortunately, nothing you can do about root crops should they get flooded. Also, you want to think about, okay, how long was the water there? If it's there for a week, there's a lot more potential for splashing than if it was there for 5 minutes. So you do want to make sure you're thinking about that. And also, you want to make sure the soil has a full time to dry before you start tilling it and replanting. The sunlight does a lot to destroy microbes that can make us sick. So you want to allow that extra time in your field to dry after flooding before you start tilling and getting ready to replant. There's also some bacterial diseases that can come in the soil, and you want to make sure that you're not infecting your seeds that you're putting out with those bacterial diseases that may have washed in. Recommendations of 30 to 60 days based on raw manure application guidelines. So if you think that there could have been raw manure in your field, then you want to make sure that you're waiting that typical turnaround time after you apply raw manure. Actually, I would say 120 days. But again, you want to test your soil. You want to make sure that you know what's in your soil, especially if it comes up out of a river. The big rivers around this area all carry a whole lot of heavy metals, leftovers from the industrial age. And, you know, there's a lot of things like cadmium that have been shown to be absorbed into crops that we eat. I'm trying to think off the top of my head what crops absorb them. So root crops tend to absorb lead. So if you have lead in your soil, you're going to try not to grow root crops. Cadmium, unfortunately, I can't think of which crops absorb cadmium. But if you don't know what's in your soil, you don't know what's going to go into your crops. So after you have your soil tested for heavy metal contamination, call the extension office or your local agricultural advisor that you go to and say, hey, okay, this is what's in my soil now. What can I do? What can I grow to keep my farm alive? And we will always help you with that.
COVID-19 vaccines have been safely administered to hundreds of millions of Americans, including myself. COVID-19 vaccination greatly reduces the risk of severe illness, hospitalization, and even death. The nation's top medical and healthcare experts agree that COVID-19 vaccines are our strongest tool to help stop the pandemic. So learn more at vaccinate.wv.gov or call 1-833-793-0965. Again, that's 1-833-793-0965. And please, get vaccinated.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.